All right, this is unexpected, but I got an old friend that just called me in. Let's see if we can have some fun. I was watching the Valorant channel. Man, 19,000 people watching. Just the wow, that's a big audience. It's bigger than football. Ouch. Who hit me so hard? No. No! They got us pulled in on something very. Yeah, there's some really high squad power stuff going on. No! Oh! You suck. All right, I'm going to stay on for a little bit and see if I get called in again with these guys. appropriate to be looking at French stuff. Let's make the most of it.
Which awaited him on his route. On arriving on the frontiers of Hungary, he learned the ill fortune that his companions had met with, 52, and the projects of hostilities formed, as he was told, against the army of the Pilgrims. The bodies of several of the Crusaders hung at the gates of Semlin, which the historians of the Crusades call Malville, 53, attracted his regard and drew forth his indignation. At this sight, he gave the signal for vengeance and war. The trumpet sounded, the soldiers seized their arms and hastened to the carnage. Terror preceded them into the city. On their first attack, the people took to flight and sought refuge upon the hill, one side of which was defended by woods and Ross, and the other by the Danube. They were pursued and forced into this last asylum by the furious multitude of the Crusaders. More than 4,000 of the inhabitants of Semlin fell under the swords of the conquerors. The bodies carried down by the river bore the tidings of this horrible victory as far as Belgrade. At this intelligence, the Bulgarians and Hungarians were seized with grief and indignation, and in all parts flew to arms. The Crusaders still remained in Semlin and were glorifying themselves upon their triumph, when all at once an army, assembled in haste by Koloman, King of Hungary, presented itself to their view. Peter had nothing to oppose to his enemies but the soldiers whose blind fury he had himself excited, and with whom it was impossible to make any military disposition. He did not dare to wait for the army of Koloman, and hastened to cross the Morava. On gaining the territories of the Bulgarians, the Crusaders found the villages and cities abandoned. Even Belgrade, the capital, was without inhabitants. They had fled into the forests and mountains. Peter's soldiers, after a painful march, in want of provisions, and with difficulty finding guides to conduct them, arrived at last at the gates of Nisa, a place sufficiently well fortified to be secure from a first attack. The Bulgarians showing themselves upon their ramparts, and the Crusaders leaning on their arms, inspired each other with a mutual fear. This fear at first prevented hostilities, but harmony could not last long between an army without discipline and a people that had been irritated by violence. The Pilgrims, after having obtained provisions, had just set forward on the march when a quarrel between the inhabitants and some of the soldiers caused war to break forth with inveteracy. 800 German Crusaders, whom William of Tyre-Styles, children of Belial, and who fancied they had cause of complaint against some merchants, wishing to avenge themselves, set fire to 7 meals placed upon the Nisarva. At the sight of the fire, the inhabitants of Nissa rushed from their ramparts, and falling upon Peter's rear guard, massacred all who fell in their way, bore off 2,000 carriages, and made a great number of prisoners. Peter, who had already quitted the territory of Nissa, warned of the disaster of his companions, returned immediately with the bulk of his army. The eyes of the Crusaders on approaching the city were shocked everywhere by beholding the most sorrowful spectacle. They recognized among the dead friends and brothers, and burned to revenge them. The Cenobite, however, who feared fresh reverses, had recourse to negotiations and prayers. Deputies were sent into Nissa to demand the prisoners and the baggage of his army, which had been taken by the Bulgarians. These deputies reminded the governor that they had taken up the cross and that they were going to fight in the East for the cause of Jesus Christ. They appealed to the religion and humanity of the inhabitants of Nissa, whom they called their brethren. The governor, who saw nothing in these peaceful words but the language of fear, showed himself inflexible to their prayers. He sternly sent them back to their general, telling them that the Crusaders had themselves given the signal for the war, and that he could see in them nothing but enemies. When this answer was reported to the army of Peter, every soldier was fired with indignation. In vain the Cenobite endeavored to calm their spirits and attempt fresh negotiations. They accused his fidelity, they suspected his courage. The most ardent flew to arms. Nothing was heard but complaints and menaces. And no crusader would submit to any directions but those of his own angry will. Whilst Peter was conferring with the governor of Nyssa, 2,000 soldiers approached the ramparts and endeavored to scale them. They were repulsed by the Bulgarians and supported by a great number of their companions. The fight became general, and the fire of carnage blazed on all parts around the chiefs, who were still speaking of conditions of peace. In vain the hermit had recourse to supplications to stop the mad progress of his soldiers. In vain he placed himself between the combatants. His voice, so well known to the Crusaders, was lost in the din of arms. They braved his authority. They despised his prayers. His army, which fought without order and without leaders, was routed and cut to pieces. The women, the children, who followed the Crusaders, their horses, their camp equipages, the chest of the army, which contained the numerous offerings of the faithful, all became the prey of an enemy whose fury and vengeance nothing could stop. The hermit Peter, with the wreck of his troop, took refuge on a hill in the neighborhood of the city. He passed the night in alarms, deploring his defeat and the sad effects of the violences of which he had himself given the signal and the example among the Hungarians. He had around him no more than 500 men. The trumpets and the clarions were sounded without ceasing to recall those who had escaped the carnage and had lost themselves in their flight. Whether it was that the Crusaders could find no safety but under their own standards, or whether they were still mindful of their oath, none turned back from the crusade. On the day following their defeat, 7,000 fugitives came to rejoin their general. A few days after, Peter mustered beneath his command 30,000 combatants. All the rest had perished in the battle fought under the walls of Nyssa. The army of the Crusaders, reduced to a deplorable condition, sought no opportunity of avenging their defeat, but marched with melancholy steps towards the frontiers of Thrace. They were without the means either of subsisting or fighting. They had to fear a fresh defeat if they encountered the Bulgarians, and all the horrors of famine if they came to a desert country. Misfortune rendered them more docile, and inspired them with sentiments of moderation. The pity which their misery excited was more serviceable to them than the terror which they had wished to create. When they ceased to be an object of dread, assistance was afforded them. When they entered the territories of Thrace, the Greek emperor sent deputies to complain of their disorders, but at the same time to announce his clemency. Peter, who dreaded new disasters, wept with joy when he learned that he had found favor with Alexis. Full of confidence and hope, he pursued his march, and the Crusaders, carrying palms in their hands, arrived without further obstacles under the walls of Constantinople. The Greeks, who entertained no love for the Latins, were more prodigal and kind in the assistance they afforded them from finding them less formidable. They secretly applauded the courage of the Bulgarians and contemplated with complacency the warriors of the West covered with the rags of indigence. The emperor was desirous of seeing the extraordinary man who had roused the Western world by his eloquence, and Peter was admitted to an audience of Alexis. In the presence of all his court, the emperor extolled the zeal of the preacher of the crusade. And as he had nothing to fear from the ambition of the hermit, he loaded him with presents, caused arms, money, and provisions to be distributed among his army, and advised him to defer the commencement of the war to the arrival of the princes and illustrious captains who had assumed the cross. This advice was salutary, but the most renowned heroes of the crusade were not yet ready to leave Europe. They were to be preceded by fresh troops of crusaders, who, marching without forethought and without discipline in the steps of the army of Peter, should commit the same excesses and be exposed to the same reverses. A priest of the Palatinate had preached the crusade in several provinces of Germany. At his voice 15 or 20,000 men had taken the oath to fight the infidels and had assembled in an armed body. As the preachers of the holy war passed for men inspired by God, the people believed they were obeying the will of heaven in taking them for chiefs of the crusade. Gottschalk obtained the same honor that had been conferred on Peter the Hermit, and was elected general by the men he had prevailed upon to take arms. This army arrived in Hungary towards the end of summer. The harvest, which was abundant, furnished the Germans with a ready opportunity.
Well, I haven't got invited again, so I'm gonna drop the stream. I just, got stuff going on, so let's go take care of it, and I'll see you when I see it. Take care.